Hello and welcome to the Epitome. I'm your host, Nathan Bozeman. Today we are joined with a very special guest, David Pallmann from Faith Because of Reason, and we're going to be talking about his case for an early dating of the Gospels. Let's get into it. David Pallmann, thanks so much for coming back on the channel. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on again.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. You know, at this point, you are basically like probably the apologist with the most hours of the defense of Christianity on the internet, I would have to say, because you dropped a resurrection defense that was how many hours? It was like 6 or 7 or something. And then you've defended the persecution of the apostles multiple hours. You've now defended the early dating of the Gospels with 5 hours, and I believe it was like 16 minutes of defense. So what is it about these defenses that causes it to be so long? I love it. For me, I would just say it's like you're actually engaging with basically every scholarly argument on the planet, it seems.
Yeah, well, you've kind of got two options that you can go for as an apologist, right? You can either be the person who gives like the quick, easy summary that's easy for people to digest. And there's nothing wrong with that. You know, there are people who are better suited to that. In fact, there are probably more people who want that. But then there are the people who want something more. And so that's what I try to be. I try to be the apologist who will get down and dirty in the details, who will try to look at all the counter arguments. And that just takes some time to do. So, you can kind of do short and sweet and easy, or you can do, long and laborious and boring. And obviously, I'm on the long, laborious, and boring side of things.
It's only boring if you're not like into these things, because for those of us that are into these things, oh, it's super fascinating. I've sent I've sent your video to like 3 or 4 of my friends, and we've been talking about the arguments and going through it. And so for us Bible nerds, it's like super interesting. But I could see how like my friends at church would be like, "What is this?" You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's not everyone's cup of tea.
Yeah. But again, thanks so much for doing this. I think your work is so valuable, and I love that you're willing to push back on the consensus on these things, because obviously the Gospels are typically dated to like the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and you're giving a much earlier date than that. But for those of you watching, you'll have to wait a little bit longer if you haven't seen his video to see what his actual date is. But I wanted to ask first, because at the beginning of your video, you said that the argument for early authorship of the Gospels, it's kind of lower on your importance list, I guess we could call it, for defending Christianity. You said that you would rather defend like traditional authorship, or, the fact that eyewitness testimony is what the Gospels are based in. So why do you think that the early dating of the Gospels is a little bit less important, but yet still important enough to drop a 5-hour video defending it?
So my thinking on this has always been that, you can have a source that's early, but that is from somebody who doesn't know what they're talking about, versus a source that is from several years later, but from an eyewitness. And like, which would you rather have? For me, it's going to be, I'll rather take an eyewitness, 30 years removed, versus someone who doesn't know what they're talking about from the next day. So that's kind of why I've never cared that much about like putting the Gospels early, right? I'm interested in defending that the information in there is coming from eyewitnesses, because then I can run my trilemma argument for the resurrection, right? Once it's eyewitnesses, you either have to say they're lying, they're mistaken in some way, or what they're telling you is true, right? Eyewitness testimony cuts off this legendary development sort of out that the skeptic might want to press. So that's why I've always cared about the eyewitness testimony claim a whole lot more about like, when do you want to put the Gospels, particularly because like when the Gospels are typically dated, right, between 70 and 90, that's not obviously too late to have been written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So like, hey, I can play in that sandbox, right? It doesn't matter to me that much like where you want to put the Gospels, unless someone's going to make a big deal about it, right? Mm-hmm. Because as it happens, I think that there's a very good case for putting the Gospels much, much earlier. And so it is kind of related to authorship in that way, because one reason for sort of questioning the traditional authorship of the Gospels is like, well, look how late the Gospels are. It's kind of strange credulity that, Matthew's writing as an 80-year-old man, right? And that John is writing as a almost 100-year-old man and stuff. So I do think putting the Gospels earlier, like to the extent that you put them earlier, the more credence you should have in sort of traditional authorship. And conversely, the later they go, particularly if we're like pushing back into the 2nd century, you're going to have less credence in traditional authorship. So it's not something that's completely unrelated, but I'm generally happy to just sort of play with mainstream dates and not get into early dating unless I have to.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. And, but as we'll talk about, later in the video, like some people are starting to push them later and later. I've even, I've been seeing some people put Luke in the 2nd century due to some arguments that we'll talk about later. I've even seen this new strand of scholarship. I don't know if you've seen these guys. They're like the Marcion priority guys, where they're like putting Marcion first, and then I don't know if you are ever going to engage with those guys, but I've been thinking about making some videos about why that's implausible. And their arguments from silence are super bad. They'll be like, well, the Didache doesn't mention this, and that, so therefore it doesn't exist. And Justin Martyr's the first person that mentions this, and so that's when it was made up. And it's like, okay, well, that's a ridiculous argument. But have you seen those guys, and what do you think of them? I guess is just a quick passing question.
I have seen them. But like it's mostly been an internet phenomenon. So like in Facebook groups, particularly like, the Myth Vision and History Valley people who like to History Valley, the guy behind it, he's a friend of mine, so I don't want to say him in particular. But a lot of the people in that circle get very excited by like almost anything that is like anti or like goes against traditional Christianity. And that's mostly where I've seen like this idea of Marcion priority burgeoning. I do not come across that much, if at all, in academic literature. So that's kind of one reason I haven't addressed it, because it's like it's sort of like Jesus mythicism. It's kind of around there, from what I understand. It could get to the point that it needs to be addressed, but I haven't been impressed with what I've seen from it.
Yeah, I agree. I just I've seen it a little bit more recently, just like on the YouTube world, like you said, kind of online, and like you said, it runs in certain circles of guys that are like, anything that's not the Christian view, I'll take it, and that's kind of how this theory seems. But anyways, don't want to get too in the weeds for the audience. I did want to talk about the dating of the Gospels. So, as we said earlier, the consensus, they kind of put Mark right around 70. Like some will put it like 65, 67, somewhere in there, but most put it like pretty much right at 70. And then you've got like Matthew and Luke in the 80s, and then John in the 90s. And could you explain a little bit of why they placed them there and why you think those arguments are unconvincing?
Sure. So there's actually surprisingly little when it comes to the Gospel of Matthew in the way of like reasons for putting the Gospel of Matthew late. There's almost nothing outside of like speculative theories about how like controversies between the Jews and early Christians developed, or speculating about Matthew redacting Mark's Olivet Discourse. But there's really very little hard data to suggest a late date for Matthew. Instead, it's assumed that Mark is the first gospel that's written, and that's typically put around late 60s to 70 AD, right around there. We say Matthew is based on Mark's gospel. This is kind of assumption that you need about 10 years between gospels. That in of itself is kind of, we might call that into question. But given that, then if Mark is around 70, then Matthew's going to be sometime in the 80s. Luke is presumed to be later than them. So, that's going to push us into around 90s. And Gospel of John is, put around 100. So that's kind of the thinking, is that if we know that Mark is first and we can put it right around 70 AD, then that'll help us with the others. There are some specific arguments for the other three Gospels. One for Mark is that there's this supposed anachronism in it, right? That he mentions a denarius in his gospel. And supposedly we just know that the denarius wasn't widespread in Judea prior to the Jewish-Roman War. So that's kind of one question, because there's this kind of question-begging argument that, they know about the fall of the temple, right? So that's why they have to be after 70 AD. But of course, that's kind of a circular argument. It assumes Jesus didn't predict this. So if you put that to the side, then maybe you've got this denarius argument for putting Mark around 70. Matthew's supposed to know Mark, so again, around 80. there's this idea that Luke is dependent on the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, particularly on his work, Antiquities of the Jews. We know that's published right around 93 AD. So that's going to put Luke after that at some point. And then as for the Gospel of John, it's the high Christology in John. So it's like, wow, clearly we know early Christians just couldn't have had this high of a Christology. So that's got to be way late, right? That's got to be late 1st century, early 2nd century. So that's kind of the general arguments that you would have for that sort of time screen. As to why I don't think that they're convincing, I don't think that the mention of a denarius is anachronistic. This mostly is based on the work of Christopher Zeichmann. Supposedly, according to him, when we locate like these various coin hoards, these are places where like the Jews would hide their coins prior to the Jewish war. He says we don't find any denarius in there. And apparently that's supposed to mean that they weren't very widespread. That's already a pretty weak argument just on its face, because obviously all kinds of things were used that didn't, end up in coin hoards. More fundamentally, Zeichmann just like overlooks relevant evidence. We did find a coin hoard in Mount Carmel. It's pre-war, and you guessed it, it's got a denarii in there. And not only does it have denarii in there, these are not the Tiberius denarii. These are the Augustus denarii. And Augustus is emperor before Tiberius. So if we already have coins being found in Judea in coin hoards from the Augustus era, of course they were there in the Tiberius era. Furthermore, he overlooks the Nero deed. This is from the time of Nero. It's about land transaction between, it's written in Aramaic, so we know it's between Jewish people, and it specifies that the debt is for, 20 denarii on there. So there's really no particularly good reason to think that that's anachronistic. And so that opens up a much earlier, possibility for Mark, if we can accept that denarius were present there earlier. Of course, I don't accept Mark in priority, so I don't think that Matthew has to be dated after Mark. As for, the Luke and Josephus stuff, it's just, I find these arguments terribly weak. It's based on things like that they both mention Judas, Theudas, and the Egyptian, right? And that's supposed to indicate some literary dependence. I find that pretty weak. Obviously, these three rebel leaders were known by these names. So you could have common sources to both Josephus and Luke there. And you've got some interesting discrepancies between Luke and Josephus on this. A particularly interesting one regards their description of the Egyptian. Luke says that the Egyptian has, I think he says 4,000 followers. I think Josephus says that he has 30,000 followers. We know Josephus likes to inflate numbers, so it's really easy to see why Josephus might, balloon that number up to 30,000. On the other hand, if Luke is only depending on Josephus, really hard to see why he drops that down to 4,000, So there are just various things like that, various contradictions between the two that I think should make us wary of positing any literary dependence between Luke and Josephus. And then lastly, for the Gospel of John, for crying out loud, you've got high Christology in the Apostle Paul. So where is this idea coming from that we just somehow know that high Christology was a later development? So broadly, that's the overview of the case for the late dating and the overview of why I don't buy it.
Yeah. And speaking on the Christology, it's like the Apostle Paul, Colossians 1 says that all things were created for Christ and through Christ, right? It's like, I don't think you can get much higher Christology than that. I know that some people say Colossians wasn't written by Paul, but you get the idea. We could go to other passages in the non-controversial letters, but then also too, as if we even accept Mark in priority, Mark has really high Christology, so it's like, I just don't see any reason to think that developed. So just want to make sure the audience is tracking with the arguments. Maybe we have some beginners in here. So Mark in priority, all that means is that Mark was written first. Most scholars assume that. Dave Pallmann here does not agree. And I actually have been persuaded of his position that Matthew was written first based on his argumentation that we're going to get into soon. But essentially, the reason scholars date the gospel so late is because in the Gospels, Jesus predicts that the temple is going to be destroyed. And obviously he can't predict it, right? Because they're naturalists, they're atheists. So they're going to say, well, predictions of the future can't happen, prophecy can't happen. And so we have to place this after 70 AD. These documents had to have been written. Maybe we'll give Mark like 5 years, like maybe it could be seen as coming 5 years before, but we can't give them super early dates because then Jesus predicts the future and we can't have that. And then most scholars put Mark first. And so then they have to, and they say Matthew and Luke were dependent upon Mark. And so that puts them later than that. And why do you know why they say that there has to be like 10 years in between each gospel? Like, that just seems really weird to me.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's like a reason for it. It's just kind of this assumption that you can't be like right after, right? The gospel's kind of gotta get spread or something like that. We're not dealing in the age of the printing press, so stuff's copied by hand. So it takes some time for the author of Matthew to, get a copy of Mark and to write his own gospel out. And so we'll say about 10 years between the writing of each gospel. Again, though, I don't really see why that is, particularly given something like traditional authorship where, the writing of these gospels is known to the leadership of the Christian world. So, of course, they're aware of these documents. But critical scholarship is not going to be on board with that. So, I don't know. It's kind of like this common knowledge. Everyone knows this, but I don't think that there's really a particularly good argument for assuming it has to be, 10 years between each gospel, thereabouts.
Yeah. And I know these gospels would have been like huge undertakings, right? So like we should give them some time, but it's like, I don't see any reason why it shouldn't take like why it should take like more than a year to write one, even if we like give it a long time, it's like writing a gospel that long, I don't think should take much longer than that, or it could potentially take much less time than that, so like you said, I don't really see any reason to put them there. But do you think I kind of summarized what you were saying pretty well for the audience? Would you say that was a fair representation of their arguments?
Yeah, more or less.
All right, so we've got these later dates from the scholars, but what I want to say real quick is that the skeptics also seem to be quite skeptical of the church fathers, because the church fathers have sayings like, Mark wrote his gospel based on the remembrances of Peter, and Matthew wrote his gospel like before he left Jerusalem, and all these things. But if that were true, then they wouldn't be written so late. And so why do you think that these scholars kind of dismiss the church fathers out of hand? Because I think your case takes them more seriously. So I just kind of wanted to talk about that before we get into your arguments.
Yeah, it's very strange. It has to be one of the strangest phenomena in all of biblical studies, that it is like the only field of history where kind of at the outset it's considered acceptable to just sort of jettison everything the earliest sources have to say. That's pretty atypical for a field of history. Yeah. Typically, if you've got pretty early sources telling you about an event in question, you want to weigh that pretty seriously. At this point, I think what's happened is that there's sort of a list of stock arguments for why you can't trust the church fathers, from they're theologically motivated, they're biased, they're legendary, they're all copying from each other, right? There's just sort of these platitudes out there. And I think it's almost inherited at this point, right? I do not think that your average New Testament scholar out there these days is being seriously exposed to church fathers. They are aware of them, but they are basically taught the perspective that, that's just late legendary stuff. You have to be aware that these people existed. They said these things, but there's this sort of, again, this kind of everybody knows hive mind that that's just stuff that you don't really take too seriously. And it's not discussed that much. I mean, here and there, you'll get discussions about it, but mainstream scholarship is not about patrology, right? They want to do their critical research apart from patrology. Again, they can trot out some stock reasons if you ask. So I'm not saying that they are unaware of the church fathers or anything like that, but I do think that they have tended to uncritically buy into this assumption that they can just sort of be put aside. And I don't think that your average biblical scholar has really wrestled with that, or could give you a really good explanation for why, beyond the sort of they contradict each other on certain points, or gesturing at something like that.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, it's just a very strange thing. And the reason I find it so strange as well is that we're not talking about a supernatural claim, right? Like we're not talking about a miracle here. We're talking about 4 documents that were written in the first century, and we're trying to figure out who wrote them. Which human beings wrote these documents, which is a perfectly non miraculous event. Is just human beings writing a document. And so for them to be so skeptical of traditional authorship, early dates, based on whatever it is that they're like whatever their reasons are for this, like I don't know, it just seems very strange to me. I understand if we were talking about a miraculous claim, they might heighten their skepticism a little bit, and fair enough. But considering we're talking about something perfectly natural, I just don't understand why it seems like to establish traditional authorship and early dates, we need to like give the amount of evidence that we do. It seems like there's this unnecessary uphill battle. Like, wouldn't you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this can be clearly seen with other documents, like non-biblical ones, where the authorship is accepted on approximately the same grounds. Right? This is the same sort of evidence that we have for thinking that Tacitus or Suetonius are the authors of their works, for thinking that Plutarch is the author of his 50 Lives. It's that other people tell us this. This is the same reason we have for thinking that, First Clement is written by Clement of Rome. We've got a whole bunch of external sources that tell us this. It's not abnormal at all for that to be the way in which a source is identified to you. So, yeah, I don't think that we're special pleading in any way. And just absent some really good reason to like go against what the church fathers say, I think that should be our starting point. Like we have our source, we have reasonably early sources. They're all telling us the same people wrote this. Yes, maybe some of them are depending on each other, but I think there's good reasons to think that others are not. And so, like, unless we have some really compelling reason to think Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did not write the Gospels, our default should be to accept what the church fathers tell us.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. And I think this is just a basic, what we might call epistemological principle, right? Which is, for the audience, that's just any kind of claim to do with knowledge. There are 4 major pathways to knowledge. There's reason, there's perception, there's memory, and there's human testimony. And so human testimony is a major pathway to come to knowledge. Like we're speaking English right now. We learned that through human testimony. Like we trusted that our parents and, our friends or our aunts and uncles, when they made sounds with their mouths, they said like can, they were like, yeah, that's a can, like we trusted their testimony, and that's how we learned English. And there's actually a pretty interesting argument there that I heard someone say, if human testimony isn't a reliable pathway to knowledge, then we couldn't even become the kind of person to question it because of how reliant on testimony we are. So all that to say, and then when it comes to testimony, as Richard Bauckham has argued, and Richard Swinburne as well in his book on the resurrection, that when testimony is given, the way that we typically treat it is we treat it as innocent until proven guilty. We don't treat it as guilty until proven innocent. And if you do some self-reflection, this is how we all operate in our ordinary lives. When I go to the grocery store and I, buy a box of Frosted Flakes and I read the ingredients list, like I trust that ingredients list is, correct. I don't come home and get a chemistry kit out and check every single thing because this is guilty until proven innocent. The way that we treat testimony is innocent until proven guilty. If we have a defeater or a strong reason to believe that it's false, then we can doubt it. But as Dave was just saying, I think it's just a principle of epistemology and testimony that we should trust testimony unless we have a defeater of it. Would you have anything to add on that before we get into your case on the patristics being reliable and what kind of, early dates we get when we actually take them seriously?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to say is that, that's just what history is, right? Maybe you get some insights from archaeology and stuff, but for the most part, it's a big game of testimony. We are depending on what other people who witnessed things that, we were not around for We're depending on what they told us about it. That doesn't mean we do that uncritically, right? It's not like we're saying, oh, you just believe anything everyone says to you. Of course not, right? Like you apply your, reasoning skills to this. You think like, do they have some motivation to lie to me about this? Is what they're saying being corroborated by others? So, of course, I'm not advocating, as, some people have, I think, uncharitably said, that I'm like saying that you should just, believe whatever the church fathers say. Like, no, of course not, but you treat it like you would any other historical source. You take it into account and you don't just, toss it out because that's fashionable in contemporary scholarship.
I agree. And so now that we've kind of established, like, okay, the consensus on scholarship is kind of based on this naturalistic assumption that, well, you can't predict the future. So of course the gospels have to be later than 70 or around 70 with Mark. And then we've kind of established, like, it's also based on just throwing the church fathers out. Let's open our minds a little bit to everyone in the audience. And let's say we're not going to assume naturalism, and we're not just going to throw the church fathers out of hand. Let's actually take them seriously as our witnesses to the authorship of the Gospels, which again is a perfectly natural event. It's not miraculous. It doesn't need any higher. It doesn't need to meet some higher bar to know that it's true. These are perfectly ordinary things. And let's get into this case. So you take the patristic witness pretty seriously for your case. So who are like your main witnesses, and why do you believe that I guess they should be taken as our most like highest priority, like if they're early, et cetera? Like, just walk through that for us.
Yeah. And I think it's important to say, like, we often talk about like the patristic witness, right? But technically that's a little bit of a misnomer, because these are individual church fathers, right? You can treat as individual sources. And of course, like, some are more trustworthy than others, right? In the same way that like the category of Roman historians, right? Like, some are more reliable than others. So I think sometimes like there's this sort of stigma associated with like, church tradition or church fathers or patrology, however you want to put it. And like, yeah, like we can say that some of these people, like, I don't think that Eusebius or, maybe Jerome or, Origen are perhaps like the most trustworthy church fathers of the bunch. On the other hand, though, when we look at our three earliest sources on the origins of the Gospels, these are going to be Papias, Irenaeus, and Clement of Alexandria. Now, who are these guys, right? Papias, at least, according to a significant amount of external tradition, and I think according to his own words, is a disciple of John the Apostle. So Papias is somebody who's going to be in a really darn good position to tell us about the origins of John's gospel and potentially the others, right? Irenaeus is a student of Polycarp. Polycarp was also a student of John the Apostle. So we're only one removed there, right? Clement of Alexandria, he's also part of that Irenaeus generation. His origins are a little murkier than the other two, but he's also early. And these three sources, I argue, are independent of each other. So some reasons for that are going to be based on, like, they have different information from each other. There's apparent contradictions between some of them. I think Papias tells us that his source is John the Apostle. I think Irenaeus tells us that his source is Polycarp. And Clement of Alexandria says that his sources are these sort of unnamed primitive elders, is what he refers to them as, which is possibly a reference to the apostles. It's a little unclear. And since he's a contemporary of Irenaeus, though, presumably he's not including Irenaeus as a primitive elder. So there's, I think, a decent case for thinking that these are three earliest sources for the origins of the Gospels are independent of one another. And when you're dealing with multiple independent attestation, that carries a lot more weight, right, than just one person telling you something. It's, much harder for two people to be wrong in the same way independently, right? There's only one way you can be right. There's a whole bunch of ways you can be wrong. And so if you're going to have to say all three guys are wrong, but they all somehow manage to land on like the same four names of the Gospels to tell us the origins about them, that's an uphill battle you have to face there. The best explanation is going to be, if they're all independent, that they're just telling you the truth. So that's why I give so much weight, in particular, to what those three church fathers are telling us.
And this is where things get interesting, right? Because as we spoke about earlier in the scholarly consensus, where they take Mark to be written first, they're basing this off of throwing the patristics out and then assuming that Jesus can't predict the future. But when you take those assumptions out and you say, okay, let me take the patristics seriously, what's interesting about your case is that you put Matthew first, but so do the church fathers. So could you walk through that? Like, why do you find the arguments for Mark and priority to be weak? And also, I'll just say before you get into that, the church fathers, the patristics, the testimony that we're dealing with says that Matthew wrote first, right? That's pretty much they're all pretty much unanimous on that. And so when scholars come in and say, well, Mark was written first, and this is just taken almost as like the gospel truth, like pun intended, in scholarship, it's like Mark is first, everyone just starts there and then moves on. Why do you think this is incorrect? And talk about the patristic witness to Matthew being written first a little bit too.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's kind of where I like to start, right? Is just take modern textual criticism out of it, right? We'll circle back to it. I'm not saying we're not going to consider internal evidence, but put it to the side for a minute. If we consider, like, what do our earliest sources tell us, they're all completely unanimous on that Matthew's the first gospel written. And they don't agree on everything else, right? Like, there's some legitimate disagreement over whether Luke is next or whether Mark is next. There's like pretty significant disagreement over that, to be honest with you. But they all agree Matthew's the first gospel written. Like, that's not in question. And so you kind of have to ask yourself, how did they all get that so wrong, right? I mean, that's like, you have to explain how people who are like, don't agree with each other on everything concerning the order of the gospels have all come, to be united on the priority of Matthew's gospel.
And what's interesting too, not to cut you off real quick, though, they all agree John is last too. So it's like Matthew's first, John is last. The disagreement's really about whether Mark or Luke was second.
Correct. And and that actually creates a bigger problem because one of the, like, Mark Goodacre is a scholar who's kind of like the modern champion, I guess, for Mark and priority. His story for like why Matthew got placed first in the church fathers was, they accepted traditional authorship. So, of course, they thought that the gospel written by an apostle had to be written first. And it's just kind of like, but they also all think John is last. So it seems like they didn't assume that because it was written by an apostle, it had to be written first. Yes. I don't find that to be a good explanation for why they would all place Matthew first. I think a much better explanation is just, that the gospel of Matthew was written first. So if we go with that, if we say Matthew is the first gospel to have been written according to them, then we have to circle back to, why don't most scholars agree with that, right? Were the arguments for the priority of Mark just so overwhelming that we had to put the patristic witness aside? And I think when you look at them, they the arguments for Mark and priority look less than stellar, right? You've got the old argument from order, which was, supposedly this idea that you could see Matthew and Luke following Mark's order in pericopes, except for, all these places called the minor agreements where they don't agree with Mark's order. But outside of that, the idea was, well, for the most part, you could see them following Mark's order. The problem is, like, that's like putting theory first and then interpreting data in view of it, because you could do the same thing on my view that Mark is the last synoptic. And he's just following Matthew or Luke's order, right? So this argument is reversible. And yet, this was one of the major arguments that turned scholarship in favor of Mark and priority. It wasn't until the 1950s that this argument finally got called out and slowly kind of became abandoned. And yet, to this day, it will turn up from time to time. There's the argument from Semiticisms, right? This is the idea that Mark supposedly uses more, distinctively Hebraic words than Matthew or Luke. And so the idea is because Jesus spoke Aramaic, that probably means he sort of stands a little bit closer to that. The problem is, well, one, it's actually false that Mark has the highest number of Semitisms. It's actually Matthew has the highest number. So if we're going to say more Semitisms equals earlier, then that would be an argument for the priority of Matthew. But more fundamentally, I don't agree with that whole line of reasoning. I think the amount of Semitisms likely tells you more about the audience that's being written for. So, of course, it makes sense. Matthew being written for a substantially Jewish audience would have more, distinctively Semitic words in it. And I think that's what it really is telling you more about than sort of the temporal priority of the gospel. You've got the argument that supposedly Mark has this low Christology and that Matthew and Luke correct it in places. I don't buy that. I agree with Richard Bauckham when he says the earliest Christology was already the highest Christology. By most accounts, Paul's letters are earlier than the Gospel of Mark, and Paul already has a very high Christology. So this idea that like you had to have this evolution of Christology from Mark to the Gospel of John, I think that that's just wrong. More fundamentally, I don't agree that Mark has a low Christology. I think Mark has a very high Christology. It's not as explicit as on the Gospel of John, but I think a careful reading of his Gospel will reveal that it's there. So for those reasons, I don't buy that as an argument for Markan priority. One of the more recent arguments is called the argument from editorial fatigue. So this is supposedly in Matthew and in Luke, you have these sort of continuity errors, right? And the idea is that you can explain these continuity errors by one of them, copying from Mark, and he decides to make a change. So like an example here is the healing of, I believe it's a blind man. It could be a deaf man or maybe a leper. It's one of Jesus' healings. And anyway, in Mark, it says that I think he heals in front of, well, the idea is that Matthew changes Mark's narrative, right? And has it that this crowd is present. Whereas in Mark, he's alone, right? Jesus doesn't heal in front of a crowd in Mark, supposedly. And yet in Matthew, it says this crowd follows Jesus down the mountain. And then, Jesus heals the man and then says, don't say anything to anybody. And so the idea is, there's a continuity error. It wouldn't make any sense for him to say, don't say anything to anybody if a crowd was there. And so the idea is he was like copying over from Mark, right? But he makes a change. He adds a crowd there and then he forgets that he made that change. And so by the time we get to the part in the narrative where he says, don't say anything to anyone, he's just copying over from Mark and forgot, right? That, in Mark, there wasn't a big crowd there. So I have several problems with this. In the first place, I think that there's just like not a continuity error there to begin with, right? Because it's simply not the case that there's anything inconsistent about saying about healing in front of a crowd. In fact, we have an example in Mark's gospel where Jesus heals in front of a crowd and then tells them don't say anything to anybody. So I fundamentally reject that there is a continuity error here. But there's other issues with this. I think that it kind of assumes that the gospel authors are they're not trying to engage in historical reportage here, and so that they just kind of feel free to play fast and loose with the facts. I would reject that whole approach to the gospel. And I think a lot of the putative inconsistencies you could just as easily explain in reverse, right? You could say that if you accepted that there's a continuity error there, you could say it was original to Matthew, right? And then say that, Mark came along and caught the continuity error and fixed it. So if you want to insist there's a continuity error, you can just explain that in reverse. I also find it psychologically implausible. Like, we're really supposed to believe that Matthew and Luke are making a change to something in Mark, and then 2 sentences later, they already forgot about that. I mean, are we going to say that they were dimwits? So I don't buy that. And then I'm sympathetic to a point that Ward Powers makes, where he says that this whole argument kind of makes Markan priority unfalsifiable. Because there's all these cases where they want to say that here's some mistake in Mark, right? Something that doesn't make sense in Mark. In Matthew or Luke, they fix that, right? But now in this case, where we're saying it makes more sense in Mark, now it's being interpreted as editorial fatigue. Well, this is like a heads I win, tails you lose, right? When Mark makes better sense than Matthew or Luke, then that's evidence for Markan priority. When Matthew or Luke make better sense than Mark, that's also evidence for Markan priority, But it's just, no matter how it falls, it's always the evidence is for Markan priority. And so I think that should just make us a little bit suspicious that maybe we're starting with our conclusion here.
Yeah. I think that, and if you notice, again, none of the arguments you just gave are based on taking the patristic seriously. You're never going to hear them quote a church father saying Mark was written first. You're never going to hear them, be like, Mark had to be written at this time because of this particular miracle claim, like, because they're not going to believe that, right? So again, it's these assumptions that we talked about earlier, which is why I wanted to cover them before we get into this, because their arguments are basically, they're critically analyzing the text of the Gospels, and then they're making these conclusions that Mark is first, because I've heard some say that the language is simpler, and Matthew and Luke's a little more elegant. I've heard some say that, kind of like you said, the editorial fatigue, like these kinds of things. Mark is a little bit choppier, like, so that just means it's earlier, right? Like these kinds of ideas. And again, there's just no reason to think that, right? If maybe Mark just wasn't as good of a writer as Matthew, or there's plenty of reasons that doesn't necessitate, oh, this is a little more choppy, therefore it's written earlier. I wonder what you think of that kind of stuff too.
Yeah, the arguments just tend to be very speculative, is I think what you'll find is that the arguments from, for Mark and priority will tend to be very like doing what Lydia McGrew calls like a priori history, right? But you're not going to ever find this backed up in a source that this is the way they did it. I think there's quite a bit of over-reading. There's a lot of insistence that there are contradictions here, right? So anytime there's a difference, it's like assumed, oh, they must have made a very deliberate change. And sort of like, as someone who takes a conservative position, I just want to harmonize that stuff anyway. So like, I don't want to grant that there's an inconsistency or like a deliberate redaction of the sort that, would be significant here in the first place. It's kind of one reason it's surprising to me that like evangelicals and conservative scholars have been so quick to hop on the bus of Mark and priority, because so many of the arguments for it depend on things that like I think we want to resist anyway, like that there's contradictions or that Mark has a low Christology or whatever. Like as a conservative Christian, I don't want to take any of that on board anyway. So like if you're rejecting a lot of the bases for these arguments for Mark and priority in the first place, I don't get why you would just hop on board with the conclusion. Like there doesn't seem to be a good reason for that. So yeah, that's my thoughts on that.
All right, so I have one argument that I've had for Mark and priority for a while, and I've thought about it a little bit, and so I'm going to try to steel man the argument here, because this is actually something that I held to for a while, and before like kind of hearing your arguments for Matthean priority. And so I want to maybe give our skeptic friends, here's a way to have Mark and priority that actually takes the patristic witness seriously and all of that. So, the Gospel of Mark, it is said by pretty much all the patristics that it was based on Peter's sermons. Okay. But then we have this problem that 90% of Mark is in the Gospel of Matthew. So if we assume that Matthew wrote first, it would seem that Mark's main source is actually Matthew rather than Peter's sermons. And so if that's the case, then it seems like this will once again cast doubt on the patristic. So it almost seems like we could make a contradiction where it's like, okay, if we take the patristic seriously, then we actually end up having to not take them seriously, because it's Mark is based on Matthew and not Peter's sermons. And so it kind of creates this contradiction here. So I wonder what you think about that. And the solution that I had that kind of like, in my opinion, saved this, it was like, okay, Matthew wrote like first, maybe it was a Hebrew gospel or something like that, because a lot of the early church fathers could be interpreted as saying that, Matthew wrote in Hebrew first, and then Mark wrote after that, and then Matthew took his Hebrew gospel and Mark and made this like bigger gospel in Greek, and then Luke was written after that, and then John was written last. So and Luke would have been using Matthew and Mark as the source. And so I wonder what you think of this like contradiction argument, where it's like, if we take the patristics seriously, we end up having to not trust them again. And then secondarily, how would you respond to this in regards to Matthean priority? How can we say that Mark was based on Peter's sermons if 90% of it is in Matthew?
So I think one thing to say is I think the number can be put a bit lower than 90%. In his book, The Progressive Publication of Matthew, Ward Powers does his own sort of analysis of this. And what he finds is that 90% number is based on being like very generous to what material you're counting. If you're a bit stricter, then you get a number closer to 80%. But I mean, the same question still emerges, right? Obviously, there is a strong degree of literary dependence between Matthew and Mark, right? There's a lot of verbatim agreement there. You don't get that by authors writing independently of each other. So, like, I want to affirm Matthean priority, and I want to, like, on the basis of the patristics, right? I want to affirm Matthean priority on the basis of the patristics, and I also want to affirm that there's literary dependence, so I want to say that Mark depends on Matthew. But the patristics also say that, Mark is based on the sermons of Peter. So what do we do there? Well, I've got kind of two solutions here. So the one that I prefer is one that's defended by Bernard Orchard, which is that when Peter went to Rome, he had both the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, and that he preached his sermons from there. And so that's why so much of that material is incorporated into Mark's Gospel. I'm fine with that. The other alternative, and this is going to depend heavily on the testimony of Clement of Alexandria, Clement of Alexandria tells us that the Gospel of Mark basically comes into existence this way. Peter is preaching a sermon in Rome. At the end of it, the Praetorian guards come up to him and ask, can we have a copy of that sermon? And Peter says to Mark, hey, come over here, take care of these guys. And so now poor Mark has to write something up for them. So what you could say is that Mark has Matthew and Luke as Gospels, and so he kind of goes through these, and what he sees in them would be okay, yeah, Peter said that part. I remember Peter said that part. And so he's kind of blending Matthew and Luke together, doing his best to use what Peter preached as his guide. And so is kind of haphazardly blending Matthew and Luke together. This is rendered somewhat plausible by this phenomenon of conflation that turns up in Mark. If you look at the way the Gospel of Mark reads, it often looks like, if you assume Matthew and Luke are pulling from Mark, they have preserved opposite halves of his stuff, just opposite portions. Whatever the other one didn't have, the other guy took that. And it's very hard to explain that. It's very strange to think why they should do that. Whereas if you think that Mark is written third, it's very easy to explain this. He's got these two Gospels in front of him. They're somewhat similar in places, and so he just kind of blends it up. He blends it up into a cohesive narrative. This accounts for certain redundancies in Mark. It occurs for why you've got distinctively Matthean language that turns up in Mark. So that's sort of my thoughts on what you're saying there. I do think that Mark used the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. I'm open to that being due to that Peter himself used those Gospels. Or we could put that aside, that Mark just kind of had the Gospels, and so he used those to sort of jog his memory, as it were, of what Peter had preached in Rome. So those are two possible solutions for you there.
Yeah, and this would, just in case anybody missed it, that would resolve the supposed contradiction where it's if we take the patristics seriously, we'd then end up having to distrust them because Peter's sermon was not actually a source of Mark. If if Peter was actually preaching from Matthew and Luke, then Mark would still be Mark would still be sourced by Matthew and Luke, but that was just what he was preaching. So that would resolve this contradiction, and it allows you to preserve the patristic witness as reliable. And so I basically think that that's correct. And also I will say that argument from conflation is, in my opinion, the strongest argument for Matthean priority, because for those of you that weren't able to follow, essentially there are some passages in Mark where you will have 3 or 4 words from Matthew, and then you'll have 3 or 4 words from Luke, and then it just goes back and forth like that for a paragraph. And like Dave was saying here, if Matthew and Luke wrote second and they're using Mark as a source, it's very weird to think that they would take a couple words, and then Luke would take these words, and then Matthew would take these words, and they would do that back and forth over and over again. However, if Mark is blending Matthew and Luke, it's very easy to see how he would take some words here, take some words there. It's much, much easier to explain in the opposite direction than it is to assume Mark wrote first. And so to me, if we're going to look at the internal evidence and like throw out the patristics, even if we did just look at the internal stuff, it still seems like Matthean priority makes the most sense. Like, wouldn't you agree with that? Like, that argument seems way stronger than like anything we mentioned for Markan priority.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have this kind of stuff with Markan priority because, like we said, most of that is speculative. This is actual data, right? Like whatever is going on, it is just either is the case that Matthew and Luke preserve opposite halves of Mark, or that Mark blended these two together. And there's no reason like to think that, like, particularly if you think that Matthew and Luke are independent of each other, that they just so happen to preserve opposite halves of the narrative. Best case scenario, you could say that Matthew maybe like took some stuff and that Luke is like reading both of them and is like, oh, I saw what you did, Matthew. You know, you didn't take this stuff. Well, you know, psych, I'm going to put that stuff in my gospel here. That's still weird. That's still hard to make sense of to me. Is like, we're really going to say Luke was doing that? It's just so much easier to me to say that Mark blends the two together. And so, yeah, like that's not even depending on patristic testimony or anything. Like that's data. Like you have to make sense of that particular phenomena in Mark's gospel.
Yeah, and so it seems like for the patristic witness, as we're calling it, even though, as you said, they're individuals, and it's kind of weird to use that word, but just for the simplicity, the patristic witness put Matthew first. And then when we look at the internal evidence, to me, by far, the strongest internal argument is going to be, you know, this argument from conflation. And so I think no matter where you look, internal to the Gospels or external, Matthean priority seems to just come out on top. And as I said, the only real holdup I had was this argument about Mark being dependent on Peter's sermons. But if we just assume that Mark or Peter rather was preaching from Matthew and Luke, then it makes a whole lot of sense why a lot of Mark would be present in Matthew and Luke. So it seems like we've got Matthean priority, you know, established here. So now that we've done that, if you guys can follow us this far and say, okay, Matthew is written first, what do we do with that now? Now I want to talk, since this is a video on like the early authorship of the Gospels. Now what I would love to do is get into your case. How early is Matthew? You know, because when I first started watching your video, truthfully, I was like, I think he's going to put it like early 50s, you know, mid 50s, like around, maybe he has something in Paul, like maybe Paul's dependent on Matthew and like he can get Matthew in the late 40s, early 50s. But you even surprised me and went further than that. So take it away. I'd love to just have you talk on this for a little bit.
Yeah, well, it surprised me too, because I was expecting to get like a maybe 55 date for Matthew, and I really would have been happy with that. But yeah, I ended up putting it much earlier. And like, spoiler alert, I put it at 42 AD, and we'll get into the reasons for why I go that early. So the first thing that like I want to address is just like kind of again begin with what do the patristics tell us, and is there some reason that we're like forced off of that, right? Because like again, I do think that patristic witness is defeasible, right? I'm not like just gonna assume what they say, but that's kind of my starting point, because that's the information that we have from the dead, right? From that time. And so they are pretty clear that it's written at least in the lifetimes of Peter and Paul. And for those who don't know, Peter and Paul are executed in the Neronian persecution. That's between 64, 67 AD. Typically, scholars put their martyrdoms towards the beginning of that. So we're looking at like a 64 date for when Peter and Paul are killed. Now, what the patristics are telling us is that, like, for sure, Mark is written during the lifetime of Peter. And so that means the Gospel of Matthew, because they put it before Mark, is going to be earlier than that. So if, you know, Peter and Paul are killed 64 AD, it's in their lifetime. It can't be written any later than that. So like that's at least putting us in a pre-70 sort of a 60s date right there. So that's kind of my starting point, right? Now, another thing is this epistle called First Clement, right? Now, this is a very early letter. In fact, it's probably one of our earliest like Christian sources that did not make it into the Bible, is First Clement. And it appears to be familiar with the Gospel of Matthew. You've got particularly like statements for the Sermon on the Mount. You seem to have quotations of like Matthew 18, Matthew 26, Matthew 5, Matthew 7, sort of all these allusions to it. And so the bottom line is First Clement seems to know about the Gospel of Matthew. Now, mainstream scholarship puts First Clement around 96 AD, 95, 96 AD. But there are actually pretty good reasons to put First Clement earlier than this. One of these is that First Clement still seems to be under the impression that sacrifices are still going on at the temple in Jerusalem. Remember, the temple's destroyed 70 AD, so presumably he's writing before 70 AD. He also refers to the martyrdoms of Peter and Paul using very interesting language. He says that they are the most recent spiritual heroes and that they are like raised up in our own generation. Some translations say like nearest to our own time. So basically the idea is that when First Clement is written, it's not long after Peter and Paul died. Remember, that happens around 64. And he's writing in an era of persecution. Now remember, the Neronian persecution ends in 67 AD. So if Peter and Paul are killed around 64, I'm going to say that First Clement's probably written around 67. So that's a pre-70 date for First Clement. And if it knows the Gospel of Matthew, then the Gospel of Matthew also, has to at least be in the 60s at the very latest. So that's a further argument for putting Matthew at least before 70 AD. You've also got various internal considerations that favor this sort of date. So, for example, Matthew's Olivet Discourse, he has, Jesus saying that you should not depart from Jerusalem on the Sabbath, or that you should not, run away in the winter. So Jesus is giving advice essentially to people who are going to live through the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Now, it makes sense to include that information if you're writing before that time, because the people who live through it can benefit from Jesus' advice. On the other hand, if you're writing after 70 AD, why include advice for people who are going to live through this time? Like, it's already over. So some of the stuff in Jesus' Olivet Discourse would favor an earlier date. Now, you also have interesting ways that Matthew talks about the temple. He talks about it in the present tense in Matthew 21, right, where Jesus condemns the Jewish religious leaders, saying that they turned the temple into a den of robbers. He uses a present tense, kind of implying that the temple still exists and that they're still turning it into a den of robbers. Matthew has Jesus give specific advice not to swear by the temple or the altar. That would serve no practical purpose after the temple was destroyed. And then you also have this special interest on Matthew's part for the sect of Sadducees. Matthew is unique in that he has 7 different spots in his gospel where he just takes time out to offer polemics against the Sadducees. Now, the fun thing is the Sadducees, they don't exist anymore after 70 AD. Almost all of them perish in the destruction of the temple, and their ideas certainly have no sway after that. So, why write polemics against them, right, if you're writing after that? It'd be kind of like me writing polemics against, people who, supported Al Gore in the 2000 election, now in 2026, right? There's no reason to at that point. Al Gore doesn't have anyone who wants him to be president anymore, right? So it's kind of like that. Why criticize the Sadducees if you're writing after the event? So we've got several sort of internal factors there. Oh, one other one is Jesus's endorsement of paying the temple tax. That tax did not go away after the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. It was just diverted to the temple of Jupiter in Rome, and so it became resented among the Jews, because prior to 70, the temple tax was seen as being paid, to the one true God of Israel. Now it's resented. And yet Matthew just has Jesus endorse paying the temple tax. And it's really hard to think he wouldn't have given any clarification if this is being written after the temple's destroyed. So those are a few reasons to put it pre-70, right? And that's already getting us earlier. We also have some manuscript evidence. There is a manuscript known as P64. It's 3 small fragments. There are earliest fragments of Matthew's Gospel. Based on the lettering style, there's some reason to think that these could be dated as early as 66 AD. Scholar Karsten Peter Thiede, he's a German scholar. He's argued a lot for that date. It's not to say his arguments can't be disputed. I think that they can be. But I think that that's a challenge to saying that Matthew is definitely written late, right? If we've got manuscript evidence of Matthew that at least potentially dates that early, I think we should be open to an earlier date for Matthew's gospel. But all right, let's get to like the really good stuff, right? Why push it into the 40s? Well, I think the first reason is that Paul appears to be familiar with the Gospel of Matthew in 1 Thessalonians. So 1 Thessalonians and Matthew 24 have like an identical eschatology. And they're actually useful as a lot of the same metaphors. So this idea of that the coming of the Lord is going to be preceded by this metaphor of birth pangs. It's in both 1 Thessalonians and it's in Matthew. Right? The idea that the coming of the Lord is going to be swift, right? It's going to be sudden. It's going to be like a thief in the night. That's a verbatim match between 1 Thessalonians and Matthew 24. So you've got a lot of shared imagery, a lot of shared words here. It's hard to think that there's not some sort of literary relationship there. And now, 1 Thessalonians is one of Paul's earliest epistles. It's dated about 50, maybe 51 AD. So if he knows the Gospel of Matthew, that's going to push us into the 40s. You could try to say, like, look, maybe the dependence goes the other way around. Matthew might be pulling this from Paul. But in my video, I go through several examples of where the language is distinctively more Matthean, where the usage is more Matthean, right? Certain things like some of the words, like the term Gregorio, which basically translates to, like, be watchful. Matthew loves that term. He uses it all the time. Paul doesn't use it that much. In fact, I think he only uses it one other time outside of 1 Thessalonians. Associating angels with the second coming. Paul doesn't usually do that. Matthew does it all the time, and yet Paul's associating angels with it here. So there's a lot of reason to suspect that the imagery and language is more original to Matthew. And so barring some like reason to assume that Matthew has to be later than the letters of Paul, it would seem most natural to say Paul is pulling this language and imagery from the Gospel of Matthew. But that's the very beginning of the 50s. That forces us to a 40s date for the Gospel of Matthew.
And before you get to the early 40s, I did want to just hop in here and say that 1 Thessalonians, for those that aren't aware, that is, there are some letters of Paul that are considered like non-authentic. Like some scholars argue like Paul didn't actually write these. But 1 Thessalonians is basically unanimously agreed upon that, yeah, Paul actually wrote this. And so maybe someone might want to question like, oh, well, maybe Paul didn't write it or something. But you're going to be fighting an uphill battle because even these critical scholars that are denying all the things we talked about earlier, they'll even say, yeah, Paul wrote 1 Thessalonians. So I think that's a really important piece of data.
Yes, 1 Thessalonians is one of the indisputed ones. You can also make the case that 2 Thessalonians is also dependent on Matthew. And in fact, I do in my video, but that one is more controversial because, of course, the authenticity of 2 Thessalonians is a little more iffy. But all right, so if Matthew has to be written in the 40s, then when in the 40s? And so now we get to an original argument. This is my own argument, so, take it for what it's worth, but I think it's interesting. It's based on this convergence between our two earliest sources, Papias and Irenaeus. They both give us two different time markers for when the Gospel of Matthew is written, and neither one gives us a precise date, but when we track down the date of the time markers that they give us, they converge on the date of 42. So let me explain a little bit. Papias tells us that Matthew writes his Gospel right before he leaves Jerusalem. Okay, so we ask, when did that happen? When did Matthew leave Jerusalem? Well, we have three independent sources, all from, the 2nd century, so they're all reasonably early. And they all tell us that the disciples all leave Jerusalem 12 years after Jesus' resurrection, or crucifixion, if you don't believe the resurrection happened. But they all happen, they all leave Jerusalem 12 years afterwards. The crucifixion happens, about 30 AD? So 12 years later, that's going to put us at about 42 AD. This is also supported in the Apocryphon of James, right? It's not considered an especially reliable text, but it does say at the end that James, who kind of became the leader of the Jerusalem church after the apostles, that he sent them all away at the same time. So, again, supporting this idea that they all leave at the same time. You also have this kind of supported in Acts 8:1. It says a persecution breaks out against the Christians, and they all flee from Jerusalem. And then it says, except for the apostles. So this idea that the apostles were staying in Jerusalem for some reason. So all in all, I mean, we've got a decent amount of sources telling us that the apostles hang around in Jerusalem for 12 years before leaving. So according to Papias, Matthew writes his gospel right before he leaves Jerusalem. When did that happen? 42 AD. So when does Papias say that Matthew wrote his gospel? 42 AD. Okay, put that on the shelf, put a pin in that. Come now to Irenaeus. When does he say the Gospel of Matthew is written? He says it's founded while the church at Rome is being founded. Okay, when is the church at Rome founded? Well, interestingly, Eusebius and Jerome both provide us with what's called a chronicon, right? This is this running table of dates, and they date the founding of the church at Rome to, you guessed it, precisely 42 AD. So Irenaeus dates the Gospel of Matthew's authorship to the founding of the church at Rome, right? So different time marker from Papias, and yet they are both converging on this date of 42. And so I call this the convergence argument, because seemingly independently, right, they're both giving us this different time marker, yet when we track it down, it converges on a date of 42 AD. And so that's why I ended up on such an early date for the Gospel of Matthew.
Yeah, and to me, this is a super exciting argument because, as you said, these are two sources that are telling you a date of 42, but they're doing it in different ways, which leads you to believe they're independent. It's, when the church at Rome's being founded in 42 AD, or right before Matthew leaves Jerusalem, 42 AD, right? So it's like very interesting that they both kind of independently give you this exact same date. And again, guys, the scholarly consensus is that Matthew's written, late 70s, early 80s, like somewhere in that ballpark. And for this to be literally only a decade after Jesus was crucified, I think this is, really substantial and really important. I don't know. I think have you been receiving pushback and stuff? Like, I'm sure you have, but like, how has this been received so far?
Yeah, I mean, a few points. Probably the three major ones are to dispute the one statement as coming from Papias that says that Matthew wrote right before he was going to leave Jerusalem. This is based on, an argument that I find persuasive from C.E. Hill, that this fragment where Eusebius tells us that is actually coming from Papias. You can't dispute that. It doesn't really matter that much, though, wherever Eusebius is pulling this from. It's still telling you that Matthew wrote, when he left Jerusalem. So you're still getting a convergence, even if it doesn't come from Papias. And I think the evidence is very strong that is coming from Papias. Another point of pushback would be that the 12 years thing is some sort of like early Christian theologizing because there were 12 apostles, so therefore it took 12 years. I find that kind of speculative. Like, none of the sources that I appeal to say it was like a year for each apostle or something like that. So that's kind of just like people reading into it. There's no like particular reason that I know of to doubt that that this took, they left after 12 years. And that's kind of supported, in fact, by other sources saying that the church at Rome was founded in 42 AD. That's about when we would expect, right? If it was founded by Peter, after obviously he leaves from Jerusalem, again, like it's going to be 12 years. So I don't think all the evidence can be explained away as just theologizing. There doesn't seem to be any particular reason to go there, except to, explain away my argument. And then the other point of pushback would be that Irenaeus seems to be a bit confused because he says that the church at Rome is founded by both Peter and Paul. So that's a point of pushback. Of course, I deal with that at some length in the video. So I'm certainly not trying to hide that from anyone, that I think there is a difficulty there with Irenaeus, but I also think we can get around it. So those have probably been the three main points of pushback that I've gotten on this argument.
And how has it been received as far as like from the Christian side? Like, have you Do you have like friends or people in your life that are like, wow, this is really cool, you know?
I have one who I've persuaded. One who I believe you know, Lydia McGrew. She's not
Mhm.
too big of a fan of the argument as of right now, but trying to get her on board with it. So yeah, I've had people on the Christian side who think it's interesting, and people who have pushed back on it.
Interesting. All right. Well, I hope our audience here will kind of weigh the arguments and see for themselves. But okay, we've got an early date for Matthew, and even if you don't go with the 42 date, we still have a late 40s date, early 50s if Paul is indeed literarily dependent upon Matthew. So even if you don't find the convergence argument for 42 AD satisfying, you can still put Matthew in the late 40s, early 50s. So either way, you still got a very, very early date for the Gospel of Matthew. And then pair that with Clement of Rome, writing in the early 60s, and he's dependent upon Matthew. It just seems quite clear that Matthew is much, much earlier than a lot of these scholars are, allowing and saying. But I wanted to go to Luke now because you spend a good amount of time in your video, arguing for. I actually think the majority of the video is, dating Matthew quite early, but then you spend some time on Luke, Mark, and John. Now, for Luke, we kind of already touched on this a little bit earlier that, one reason that people date Luke late is they think that he's dependent upon Josephus, which you've already kind of dealt with. It's that he kind of seems to contradict Josephus in the areas where he's apparently dependent upon him. And they also have some other discrepancies that makes it kind of weird to, I think the really interesting one you said, Josephus inflates numbers, but it'd be really weird to explain Luke lowering the numbers for some reason. So there's that. But I also think that dating Acts is really important here. So if you wanted to, give some additional reasons for dating Luke early, what would those be for you?
Yeah, well, we've got two main reasons, right? So one, of course, is going to be the classical argument from the absence of Paul's martyrdom, right? Like, what is going on? Why does he not mention that Paul is martyred? That seems to be where the story is leading, right? Like, he ends up in Rome, and then like Acts just ends there. Nothing about his martyrdom, and that's very weird. The sufferings of Paul are kind of a major point in the story, right? So it'd be a perfect ending point if you ended on the martyrdom of Paul, and it's just not there. Now, I do think some Christians like have overplayed that, right? Have said that like they think that's a decisive argument. It is an argument from silence, and you've always kind of got to be careful with those. But I do think there's a way to beef it up. And this comes from what I think is a criminally underrated argument from the book of Acts, for an early date for Acts, that comes from the scholar Martin Moss. And this is based on the general perspective that Acts has on Roman justice. Acts like contrasts Jewish justice with Roman justice throughout. And Jewish justice is like always depicted as like it's bad, it's nefarious. They're always like finding Paul to be guilty for bad reasons. And Roman justice is always, it's very fair, right? It's depicted as a smart move when Paul appeals to Caesar, even though that's what ultimately got him killed, right? It's his appeal to Caesar. But not as far as Acts is concerned. As far as Acts is concerned, that was a smart play on Paul's part. You've got this just general like idea of these Roman governors and judges are always finding Paul innocent, right? So it contrasts the two very much. Now, prior to the Neronian persecution in 64 AD, you could understand a Christian having that perspective because Rome was not antagonistic towards Christianity, at least not like super antagonistic, until the time of Nero. It's the Jews who have always been like persecuting the Christians. But like the Jewish persecution would pale compared to the Neronian persecution. Like it's nothing compared to what was coming under Nero. So we have this question, why does the book of Acts view like the Jews as so bad and like the Romans as so good? Well, my explanation is if this is before the Neronian persecution of 64 AD, also when Paul was killed, mind you, then we have a really easy explanation for this. The book reflects the Christian perspective on Roman justice prior to Nero's, horribly persecuting them. And I think that's a way to strengthen the argument from Paul's martyrdom. Because it's nearly unthinkable to me that after Paul's death, right? Like, obviously, the author of Acts loves Paul. Paul's the hero of the story. And yet, we're going to say that the person who killed him, the empire who killed him, we're going to depict them positively? Really? Like, I cannot fathom that. Couple this with the way that the book of Acts talks about Nero. It just refers to him as Caesar. Now, we've got kind of a dog who didn't bark argument here, because after Nero died, everyone hates Nero. Okay, you got to be clear on this. Everyone, Christian, Jew, Roman, everyone hates Nero, right? He kills his own mother. He persecutes Christians. He burns Rome. Nobody likes the Emperor Nero. And after Nero is dead, the whole Roman world collectively says good riddance. I mean, nobody cares about Nero. He's universally vilified. So if Acts is written after Nero is dead, it is literally the only source written after the death of Nero that refers to him respectfully and deferentially just as Caesar, the way that the book of Acts does. That's completely understandable. If it's written while Nero is still in power, you don't want to speak ill of him. He hasn't started persecuting Christians yet. Yeah, we could totally understand a Christian having that sort of view and referring to Nero that way. You have to say this is the exception, that there's no other source in the Christian or Roman world like that would refer to Nero this way after Nero died. So you really have to say that like it's a complete anomaly. And I just can't bring myself to believe that. Along these same lines, you've got a description of Lucius Annius Gallio, and he's just referred to as Gallio in the book of Acts. Like everyone knows who you're talking about. The guy was like proconsul for 1 year. Nobody knows who he is. Like the guy shouldn't be known unless, you're writing while he's still, fresh in the memory of the people you're writing to. But there's no way you just refer to him familiarly as Gallio if you're writing after 93 AD. So these are some additional arguments, I think, for placing Luke and Acts quite a bit earlier than they often are.
Yeah, and I would also supplement that as well with the we passages from in the book of Acts. Like there are moments in the book of Acts where if you read them carefully, you'll notice that Luke tends to speak in the third person. Like Paul went here, Peter went here, in the Gospels, Jesus went here. But then strangely, towards the end of Acts, he starts saying, we went here, we did this. And, if we corroborate that internal evidence with the external evidence says Luke was a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. And so that very easily explains why there are we passages. It's like, hey, maybe the author is with Paul on these trips,
Okay.
And then you've got Colin Hemmer's book right here, Acts and Hellenistic History, right? And he locates, I believe it's 84 different facts that Luke gets correct that are difficult to get correct. Like you just said, titles of certain governing officials. He gets, certain cities right. We went from this town and sailed across here and went to this place. And sure enough, that's exactly correct. There's even a book on my shelf over here. It basically, it's about, it like analyzes the we passages and like the traveling. And it basically concludes that the author of Acts is not a sailor, but he was definitely there. And I think that's pretty interesting that if you just analyze those parts, it's like you've got someone who is not, typically used to the sea, but was definitely an eyewitness. And what does tradition tell us? That Luke was a doctor. So yeah, he wasn't a sailor. And so if you just, analyze the text itself, I think you'll get like this author is a traveling companion of Paul. Now, obviously that doesn't get you like prior to 64 AD, which is what you were talking about. But I do think this gets us like the author is definitely Luke, like it is traditionally said. And if that's the case, then there's no real reason to place it in the 90s or, in the 2nd century, like these critical scholars want to do with saying he's dependent on Josephus. If we have traditional authorship, why on earth would we believe that Luke was still alive and writing things in the 2nd century and able to get all these small and difficult details correct?
Particularly if you think Luke was executed with Paul, because there is some tradition saying that. Another point I think to sort of raise against dating it so late as, say after 93, I think comes from some citations of Luke. You have one in Ignatius of Antioch. Ignatius is martyred in 107. So, if we're going to say that, Antiquities is published in 93, Ignatius is writing 107 at the latest, that's a pretty small window of time to say that both Luke and Acts are written, And I think we can push it back further, because I think, and I argue for this in the video, I think Papias is late 1st century. Like, I don't want to put him later than 100. And Papias, there's 2 places where he appears to quote the Gospel of Luke. So, say Antiquities is 97, say Papias is writing in 100, that's only 7 years for, Luke and Acts to be written, if you want to say he's dependent on Josephus before Papias knows about him. I think
but every document takes 10 years.
Maybe we should start rethinking the idea that he knows Josephus, and push Luke and Acts quite a bit earlier into the 1st century.
Apparently it would take 20 years to write Luke and Acts. So, I mean, I don't know that I don't think 7 years is long enough. He needs 20. Okay. So we've got, a pretty early date for Acts as well. Is there anything that you want to add that gets us even earlier than, these pre-Neronian persecutions, or would you say that kind of exhausts your case for like an early date of Luke?
Well, there is, I think, some Pauline knowledge of the Gospel of Luke as well. And the clearest example here is going to come from the stuff that Jesus says about the Last Supper, or that Paul quotes Jesus as saying about the Last Supper in 1 Corinthians 11. So when Paul recounts this, I mean, it's like a verbatim match for Luke 22, 18 through 20. So again, like, it's a question of who's pulling this from who, right? Now, given what I argued for before, right, that Matthew preceded both, Luke and Paul, Matthew also relates the Last Supper. And I've argued that Paul is familiar with the Gospel of Matthew. I also think that Luke is familiar with the Gospel of Matthew. So they have a common source on the Lord's Supper, and yet neither of them pulls from it. So we have this interesting question of who's going to be more likely to have changed, who's going to, to have departed from Matthew's Gospel. There's no particular reason to think that, Paul would do that on his own, whereas Luke, he tells us straight up front that, like, he's got a whole bunch of different eyewitnesses that he's pulling from. I think we know one of those is Matthew, but evidently not for the Last Supper, right? He thinks he's got a different eyewitness for that. And so that's, he departs from Matthew in all kinds of places. I think he has good reason to do so based on, other eyewitness sources. And I think that's what he's doing in his case at the Last Supper. But now, given that, remember, Luke is a traveling companion of Paul. So Paul would have a very good reason to depart from Matthew's stuff on the Last Supper if in between when 1 Thessalonians was written and when 1 Corinthians is written, the Gospel of Luke was written, right? A gospel written under his own apostolic authority by his own traveling companion. And so that being the case, I think it's a little more likely that Luke would change this, and so that Paul is here dependent on the Gospel of Luke. Now, the fun thing with 1 Corinthians is it's written 56, 57 AD. So if he's pulling this from the Gospel of Luke, then the Gospel of Luke has to be dated, earlier than that. You can't date it later than, 56, 57. So that would be another thing that would push us a little bit further. There's also this interesting statement in Galatians 3:1, where Paul's rebuking the Galatians, and he says that Christ was, sort of displayed before them, or that he was, I think the exact word that he says is that it's, well, the exact word he uses is prographo, right? When he's saying that, that this was displayed before or portrayed before their eyes. But the word literally translates to previously written. That's what it means. So the literal translation is Paul is saying that it was like previously written before their eyes that Christ was crucified. That could be a reference to either Matthew or Mark, or rather Matthew or Luke, given that Paul kind of has a preference for the Gospel of Luke. That's maybe the one I prefer to go with, but it could just as easily be Matthew. So there's some reason to think that's what could be going on there. You've also got these statements, these enigmatic statements throughout Paul, where he says, according to my gospel. He uses that phrase 3 different times. Possibly a reference to the Gospel of Luke. Again, it'd be composed under his own apostolic authority. And then if you accept the authenticity of 1 Timothy, and I know that's, of course, going to be that's going to be controversial, but if you think that 1 Timothy is written by Paul, then in 1 Timothy 5:18, you have a direct quotation of Luke 10:7, and then a reference to it as scripture. So there's definitely some reasons to think that Paul, in some of his later epistles, is familiar with the Gospel of Luke.
Yeah, I actually find, and maybe this is, I wonder which one of those you find the most compelling, but for me, the statements of my gospel, I think that those are the most compelling in my opinion, because, according to sources, I think as early as like the Muratorian fragment in like late 2nd century, it says that Paul commissioned Luke to write a gospel because of his studiousness, right? And so Paul commissioned Luke to write the Gospel of Luke according to the early church. And so it seems, as you said, that it would have been commissioned under Pauline authority. That's why the Gospel of Luke is considered scripture and authoritative. And so when Paul says, according to my gospel, it seems quite reasonable to believe that maybe along with his letters, like maybe he sent to the Church of Rome a copy of the Gospel of Luke and a copy of the book of Romans. Like there's no reason to think that couldn't be possible if, Luke was with him and, they had copies of Luke, even though, again, it would have been expensive to make those during those time. That might be your only argument against that, is like how expensive they were to make.
But Paul does say he's sending a brother whose fame in the things of the gospel has been increased at one point. And he's almost certainly talking about Luke there. So it is very suggestive, I think the best case still comes from 1 Corinthians 11, because again, it's an exact match for the Last Supper in Luke. But you definitely have a lot of other statements in Paul that are tantalizingly suggestive.
Yeah, I totally agree. So this gets us, Matthew as early as 42 AD, maybe if you aren't convinced of the convergence argument, late 40s. You've got Paul pretty obviously, and I agree with you. I think 1 Corinthians 11 is very strong. I forgot about that when I was just referencing the strongest argument for me. But, Paul is quite clearly, I think, referencing the Gospel of Luke in multiple instances. And so we've got a early 50s to late 40s date for the Gospel of Luke as well. So now let's move on to the Gospel of Mark, which I agree with you. This one is the hardest one to, put a stamp on, is like, when exactly was it written? Like, we have a few things that I think can get us pre-70, but it's kind of hard to go beyond that. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, the Gospel of Mark is a bit of an enigma. This is largely because it was just the least popular gospel in the early church. So you've got much less explicit citation of it. And so that makes it a little bit harder to date, by saying, well, it has to be dated as late as this. Your first uncontroversial quotation of it is not till Irenaeus in 175. You've got a possible citation of it in Justin Martyr, but even those are disputed. So it's a little bit harder to date it that way. If we go with what the patristics tell us, particularly Clement of Alexandria and Papias, they say it's written during the lifetime of Peter. Some people want to say Irenaeus contradicts them on this, because he says that Mark was handed on after Peter and Paul's departure, which is probably a reference to their martyrdom. So some would say Irenaeus is saying the Gospel of Mark was written after Peter's death. What I think he's saying there is that, again, taking this with Clement of Alexandria, I think he's saying that this was written for the Praetorian Guard, And then after Peter's death, when kind of there was a need for Peter's presence, that's when Mark handed it on to sort of the Christian community at large. So I do think it's written during the lifetime of Peter. Peter dies in 64, then it's sometime in there. But yeah, beyond that, the patristics don't give us a whole lot to work with. You've got a possible statement in Philippians that's interesting, where Paul talks about that certain like the gospel's being spread among the Praetorian Guard. He's got kind of two statements, one that explicitly says Praetorian Guard, one that just talks about the members of Caesar's household. But of course, Praetorian Guard was Caesar's household guard. So possibly if Clement of Alexandria is telling us the truth when he says that the Gospel of Mark was written for the Praetorian Guard, you might have a statement in Philippians that is kind of confirming that the Gospel of Mark is doing its job from Paul. It's not as explicit as what we have in the case of Matthew and Luke. So like I wouldn't bet the farm on this illusion. But maybe if you put Philippians early 60s, then maybe you can just eke out a late 50s date for Mark's gospel. Possible. You also have some manuscript evidence in this case. You've got this fragment called 7Q5. It's a notoriously difficult fragment not to date. Actually, the date of this one is pretty secure. It's not any later than the 50s AD. What is controversial is whether or not it's a fragment of Mark's gospel. There's reasons to think it is, reasons to think maybe it's not. What I will say is that, it's been 50 years that people have been fighting over this fragment now, and no one has produced anything besides the Gospel of Mark that would be more plausible as an explanation for it. So I think that is suggestive, but again, it's not enough for me to, be super confident in that. I do take some space in my video to sort of go after Zeichmann's denarius argument. I know I already kind of went through that. That's sort of like the main argument for dating it late. That's not, going to be question begging against Jesus having actually predicted it. So I do try to show there's not a good reason to put it late. We have some indicators that it's early, but our only hard data comes from the church fathers saying it's written during the lifetime of Peter at some point.
So I do want to ask a hypothetical question. Like, let's say scholars do kind of eventually agree, like, yes, this is a fragment of Mark's gospel. What do you think that would do for the dating of Mark and even Luke? Because I know if it's dated in the 50s, and if we agree that, Matthew wrote first, Luke wrote second, don't you think that could even provide additional evidence for like Luke being prior to that, like in the late 40s, like kind of like we were just saying?
Yeah, because, I said in the 50s AD, but actually 50 AD is about the latest anyone wants to put 7Q5. So, yeah, I admit I'm a little reluctant to even go that early for Mark, because I do think Mark is dependent on the Gospel of Luke. And I think Luke is written after he becomes a companion of Paul. And I really don't think that happens till the early 50s AD. So even I'm a little iffy about putting the Gospel of Mark that early, because it makes things a little bit janky. But yeah, I mean, let's just say it came out that like we were able to prove that 7Q5 was a fragment of Mark. That would push us to very, very early dates, certainly for Luke, and well, even for Matthew. Of course, I've already proposed a very early date for that one. But and this is all assuming I'm correct, of course, about Mark being third synoptic. But yes, given that, 7Q5 would have very interesting implications for the dating of Matthew and Luke.
Yeah, that would be very, very interesting indeed. I look forward to seeing how the debates go with that particular manuscript. Like you said, 50 years and no one's even produced another possibility. So, I mean, maybe it is. And, I'm just, talking out loud here, like with a date that early, we could almost be in like autograph area. Like it could even potentially be the original Gospel of Mark at that early stage, so that would be pretty interesting.
I think Carsten Thea thinks that it is, and he thinks that if I've read him correctly, I think that he thinks that P64 is an original autograph of Matthew's gospel as well. But I think he tends to be a little over zealous about these particular findings. They're interesting, but I think he does tend to overstate the case a little bit.
Yeah, with archaeology, you do kind of have to, be a little bit more like, okay, this could be this, but we need to back off a little bit. And P64, what does that date to? Do you know?
According to Thede, it dates to 66 AD. He says that's the latest possible date for P64.
Okay.
Now, mainstream scholarship, so people like Graham Stanton and Peter Head, they want to date it to second century. Most of this is based on like paleography. The lettering of this fragment, is it closer to fragments of this era or this era? There are some interesting reasons to think it could be first century. For example, the stroke of the letters on P64, they're very unique in that the width of them doesn't change. Like if you've ever used a calligraphy marker or pen, you know that like kind of the width will change as like whether you're going vertical or horizontal with your strokes. And that's generally how Greek manuscripts go. But P64 does not. It's all the same width. Additionally, the letters almost touch. And so what Thede argues is that you do have examples of this in the first century BC, as well as the first century AD, but it's kind of fading out in the first century AD to when you get to the second century, it's just like gone. Nobody writes like this. And so that's why he favors a mid first century date for P64. My video discusses a little bit how he's been challenged on this point. So I don't want to hang too much weight on P64, but I don't think there's nothing there. There's some interesting stuff that could potentially indicate a mid first century date for it. The way I use it in the video is I say, I think as long as that's a possibility, you can't be too confident that the Gospel of Matthew dates to 85 AD. If we've potentially got a fragment of it from 66 AD, then we need to at least be open to a date that's early.
Yeah, and I think that's a very reasonable conclusion to come to. It's we're not conclusive on this, but it's possible we have a manuscript of Matthew that dates to the 60s AD. So it's it can't possibly have been written in the 80s if that was a potential manuscript. So we have to be open at the very least to an earlier date. So I like that a lot. All right, so we've got potentially an early 40s date for Matthew. I'm pretty convinced of that. I'm definitely convinced of the early 40s, or the late 40s one. I'm still thinking on the early 40s one. I think that you've definitely got an interesting case that I want to mull over more, talk over with a few more people, and I'll make my decision. But I'm definitely at the very least late 40s. I'm with you there. And then with Luke, we potentially have late 40s, early 50s, and then with Mark, we've got early 60s. Is that kind of where we're at so far?
Yeah, I would say I think Matthew, I'm pretty solidly. I want to put it at 42. Maybe you want to put it as late as 49 if you think that Paul knows it and you're not persuaded of the convergence argument. So if we go with 49 at the latest for Matthew, then Luke is going to be between 49 and 56, because 56 is when he's definitely quoted, at least in my estimation, in 1 Corinthians. And then Mark can be any time from 56 to 64, probably some point in, I would say late 50s to early 60s.
All right. Well, with that, let's get into the Gospel of John, because this is the one that's dated way late by scholars. It's typically dated to the 90s or even 100 AD. I've even seen some people say 110 AD. So what are your arguments for putting John early? I know for myself, Lydia McGrew has her book, The Eye of the Beholder, that I have right there. She's got a lot of internal arguments for why John needed to be an eyewitness, but I want to hear your arguments for dating John a little early.
Yeah, well, I actually come to a bit of an interesting position on the Gospel of John, in that this is one area where I kind of throw a bone to the late date people. I think that there's two editions of the Gospel of John. And I base this on, two things. I base this on the epilogue apparently having some material that I think comes from a later hand. And then also just the internal evidence. I see tensions in it. I see evidence that pulls towards an early date and evidence that pulls towards a late date. And so that pushes me to there being two editions of the Gospel of John. So what we do get from the patristics, right, is that the Gospel of John is written by John while he lives in Ephesus. And, when does that residence begin? We don't know. We do know it ends at the time of Trajan's reign, but that's 98 AD, So, like, from what the patristics are telling us is it could be, like, anywhere from 60 to 98 AD, like a huge range. We just know John writes his gospel while he's in Ephesus. So they don't give us a whole lot of helpful information there. On the internal evidence side of things, you have this very interesting passage in John 5:2, where it says, now in Jerusalem by the sheep gate, there is a pool. And there is a pool there it's present tense, like the pool still exists. Now, the problem is this pool is destroyed in 70 AD, right? The Romans fill it with rubble. They destroy the 5 porticos. Like, it doesn't exist after 70 AD. And yet the author of the Gospel of John is clearly assuming it still exists. So, seemingly it would be natural to date his gospel to before 70 AD. The problem is, though, that there also seems to be some evidence that goes the other way. We find this, I think, most vividly in John 21:23, right, where we have Jesus sort of tell Peter, right, that he's going to die as a martyr. And then they say, like, well, what about John? And Jesus says, if I want him to live, what is that to you? And then the author takes some space to, like, make this aside. And he says, but Jesus didn't, or he says that, like, this rumor goes out among the brethren, right? A rumor goes out that John was going to live until Jesus returned. But Jesus didn't say that. He just said, like, if I want him to live till you come back, what's that to you? So what that looks like to me is, like, in the initial edition of the Gospel of John, John had written that statement from Jesus. And because John was living so long, right, like, John dies in, like, 100 AD, right? Or maybe even a little bit into the 2nd century, like 102. So John lives a really, long time. And I think that some people had read that statement of his, right, in the earlier edition of John's Gospel, saying, like, if I want him to live till I come back, what is that to you? They interpreted that to mean that John was going to live until Jesus came back. So when John ends up dying, somebody adds to the Gospel of John, John 21:23, adding a clarification that, like, no, Jesus didn't say that. He just said, like, if I want him to live that long, what is that to you? Follow me. So it seems to me we've got a concern here that would be most pressing in the immediate aftermath of John's death. This is further kind of supported by some stuff in John 21:24, where it says that, this is the testimony of the beloved disciple, and we know that his testimony is true. So we've got kind of this interesting distinction where it says that the beloved disciple wrote these things, right? Like, it's very clear, and yet you seem to get this distinction introduced between the him who wrote these things and the we who know that his testimony is true. So just going on that data alone, we kind of get an indicator that the majority of this gospel was written by the beloved disciple, but maybe these two verses right here were not. And so what I propose is that John wrote before 70 AD, he wrote basically the entire Gospel of John, except I don't think that verses 23 and 24 were there. I think after he died, I think Papias wrote those 2 verses. So why think that it's Papias? Well, I think that 3 facts suggest this. The first one is you've got this very close association between Papias and the Apostle John. This is affirmed, I think, by 13 different sources, that Papias is a student of the Apostle John. So he's kind of associated with it. He's the kind of person we would expect. Like, if this clarification needed to be added to the Gospel of John, I think Papias is the kind of person we'd expect to add it there. The second is the anti-Marcionite prologue. The anti-Marcionite prologue tells us that Papias has a hand in composing the Gospel of John. And then the third thing, and this is an original argument to me, so, make of it what you will, but as I read the surviving fragments of Papias and I read these two verses in the Gospel of John, it seems like there's a lot of parallels there. We have in Papias this aggressive desire to correct rumors, right? These widespread rumors among Christians. Like, for example, he takes some space to correct the idea that the Gospel of Mark is inaccurate. And he's like, well, no, it's not inaccurate. It's just not written in order. Well, we see that reflected here in the Gospel of John, right? Aggressively correcting this rumor that John was going to live until Jesus returned. We have some exact verbal parallels between the two. We have this statement that of validation of John's testimony, right? That this is the testimony of the beloved disciple, and we know that his testimony is true. The Gospels don't really do this that much. They don't give you these affirmations that what they're saying is truthful or apostolic. Papias always does that. He's constantly telling you that what he's getting, it comes from eyewitnesses, it comes from apostles, and giving you affirmations that what he's telling you is true. So it really looks plausible to me that these two verses are probably added in by Papias. And so bringing it all together, I think that there's two editions of the Gospel of John. Basically everything in our Gospel of John was written before 70 AD, but after John died, Papias added these last two verses in. And I think that best explains the totality of data that we're dealing with in the Gospel of John.
Great. So that would put basically, just to recap, Matthew, early 40s, possibly late 40s, Luke, late 40s, early 50s, Mark in the early 60s, and then John pre-70, but after Mark, because pretty much the patristic witness is unanimous that John is last. So wherever we put Mark, we're going to put John somewhere between Mark's writing and 70, because of the internal evidence. And then this second edition, as you propose, of John has the last two verses to kind of, get rid of this rumor that John had said that he was going to live until Jesus came back.
Yeah, and I'd put that very late 90s, perhaps as late as early 100s.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that all of that makes perfect sense. And the only other hypothesis I could come up with, and you let me know what you think of this. In the Muratorian fragment, there's this interesting statement where, John, whenever the Gospel of John was written, there were other apostles present. It says, I think Andrew is there and Philip is there, if I'm not mistaken. And so they were kind of writing together. And if that were the case, then possibly, the part of we, attest that what he wrote is true. It could potentially even be the apostolic witness that was there when it was being written as a whole, which also can explain, Philip doesn't speak in Matthew, Mark, or Luke, but Philip speaks twice in John's gospel, which is pretty interesting that the Muratorian fragment tells us Philip was there when John's gospel was written. And then it just so happens that Philip actually has, let's call them some lines in the Gospel of John. He actually, enters stage left and actually says some stuff. And so I find that to be interesting. But I do find what you said pretty compelling about, assuaging this rumor, right? I think that it's pretty plausible that could have been added after John died. I don't see any reason to reject that. But I don't know. What do you think about the part where it says, we attest that what he said is true? Could that have been Philip and Andrew or whoever it was that was there?
It's possible, and I'm open to that. And it's even interesting because this we language is not, it's not just there that we find it in the Johannine writings, right? You find it in 1st, 2nd, 3rd John as well, right? So that is kind of a nagging doubt I've had about, this is my tentative solution, but I could come over to something that Bauckham proposes in the we of authoritative testimony. And then I would probably, take what the Muratorian fragment says a little bit more seriously there. So it's not it's kind of it's a backup hypothesis for me. I could see myself going there. As of right now, I'm pretty comfortable where I'm at. particularly, given the statement from the Anti-Marcionite prologue affirming Papias' involvement in this, along with what looks like to me stylistic similarities in John 21, 23, and 24 with the writings of Papias elsewhere. So like I'm comfortable where I'm at, but I don't see that as like a terrible or obviously absurd position that you put forward. I think it just seems to me the evidence aligns a little bit better with where I'm at. So that's my thoughts on it.
Sure. Perfect. Well, there's two potential options for you guys watching. You guys decide which one you find more plausible. David, we've been here for almost 2 hours. I did want to, first of all, before I ask, this last question, just want to thank you for coming on. It was a real pleasure to have you on to discuss this because, like you said, it's not top of the priority for defending, Christianity and the resurrection of Jesus, but it is an important topic. As you said, the later the gospel dates go, the less plausible it is that traditional authorship is true. And I'll also say, guys, David has an amazing video. It's also like hours long, but it defends traditional authorship, that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were in fact the authors of the gospel. So check that out as well. But I think this is a great supplementary case that you've put together that says, like, yeah, not only is traditional authorship true, but it's pretty plausible given how early we can get the gospel dates.
Yeah, I mean, this study really just fell out of so many other studies that I did. About 3 years ago, I began this series with traditional authorship. I did a video debunking anonymity. I did a few videos on, arguments for the historical trustworthiness of the Gospels, historical reliability of Acts, going on to like the martyrdom of the apostles, and eventually culminating with my 6-hour video on the resurrection of Jesus. And so kind of what I did in this Gospels video was like, I was never that interested in gospel dating, but there was so much material that I gleaned along the way. I was like, what if I sort of brought all that together and just, made the case for early dating? Because it also gave me a chance to update some of the stuff on my synoptic problem stuff. I mean, those videos are almost 4 years old. And, people had brought up, like, why didn't you talk about this, that, or the other thing? So I was able to update that a little bit. I'd had new developments, for example, thinking that Irenaeus is independent of Papias. I'd like proposed 3 years ago. I think there's good reasons to think his source was Polycarp. I discovered so many better reasons. So it gave me a chance to update that on C.E. Hill's thesis, for example, that Papias names all 4 gospels. I discovered Dean Furlong's stuff on that, which I think was really interesting and helps kind of broaden out Hill's case there. So it just gave me a good opportunity to kind of update a lot of the work that I'd previously done on the Gospels, but also repurpose it for something different, and just sort of all the insights I'd gleaned along the way that I do think make a really strong case for early dates. It gave me an opportunity to do that. So even though I don't think it's like a critical case in Christianity to have early dates for the Gospels, I had a lot of fun doing it. So I liked how the video turned out.
Yeah. I have one more question for you. As you just kind of mentioned, you've discussed so many different topics on your channel. You've, discussed the synoptic problem, the traditional authorship of the Gospels, the historicity of the book of Acts. I loved your epistemology videos. You totally convinced me of like internalist foundationalism and all those things, and substance dualism and all of that. And I also love your videos against presuppositional apologetics, because I'm right there with you that I don't think that's a proper method for doing apologetics. But I just wanted to ask, do you have any other like big study projects? It almost seems like with your defense of the resurrection and all of that, it's like you've covered all the major things to be like, you should be a Christian. So do you have anything you want to, I don't know, foreshadow for the audience, like what they can be looking forward to on your channel?
So I am floating this idea. We'll see if it goes anywhere, but I have kind of 2 projects in the pipeline right now. So one is I want to take on the anonymity hypothesis again, and not from the perspective necessarily of defending traditional authorship, though it'll be in line with that. But I just want to wholesale tear down the idea that the Gospels were originally anonymous, because whatever you think of the correctness of the attributions of authorship, I have been increasingly convinced that this is just absurd. It is absurd to think that the Gospels were originally anonymous. And everyone says oh, well, this all starts with Irenaeus. I have found so many sources earlier than Irenaeus that affirm the traditional authorship of the Gospels. So it's kind of related to that. I'm thinking about doing. I mean, I planned for it to be about an hour, hour and a half, but that was also how long I planned for this last video on the dating of the Gospels to be, and we know how that turned out. So we'll we'll see. That might not be a whole lot of new material, though. Some of that's going to be repurposing a lot of other material, but again, for taking down the anonymity hypothesis. The other project, I've got a Christmas special in the works. I've started writing the script for a video where I'm hoping I can get it out like in December. That's the plan. But I'm just going to take on, what's up with the Star of Bethlehem, right? What's up with the conflicting genealogies of Jesus? Did the census under Quirinius actually happen? What's up with the flight to Egypt? Is the incarnation even coherent? It's just going to be a big video of all things Christmas related. So that's coming up in the works as well.
Well, I look forward to all that stuff. I'll say the anonymity hypothesis, I did a video on that, not nearly as thorough as yours. Obviously, my videos are much shorter than yours. I think mine was like maybe 13 minutes or something. So I think that the stuff we talked about towards the beginning about epistemology and knowledge from testimony is really critical there. But also, like, even questions about why would the early Christians trust these documents if they were anonymous? Why would only the 4 Gospels be trusted and not others, like the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, like these kinds of things? You kind of have to ask the question, why these documents and only these documents? And then I've even put forward the idea where it's like, even if you assume Markan priority, even though we don't agree with that, why would Matthew and Luke use this random anonymous document if it wasn't based on Peter? It's like, I just don't have it. I can't think of any reason on the anonymous gospel hypothesis why they would do that. But on traditional authorship, it makes a lot of sense if Mark wrote first that Matthew and Luke would say, hey, this is a really trustworthy source. It's Peter, and so even if we go with like the Markan priority, it's like it just seems like it doesn't make any sense to say they're anonymous. So all that to say, I totally and wholeheartedly endorse that. And you guys should totally go check out David Pallmann. I can't believe I didn't say this at the beginning of the video, but he has a YouTube channel called Faith Because of Reason. I'm gonna link it in the description below. Do you have any like Substacks or anything like that to point people to, or is it pretty much just the YouTube channel?
I've got a really old Wix site called Faith Because of Reason, but I'm I would probably not point too many people there anymore. I kind of am embarrassed by some of the older stuff on there. So yeah, not really. It's mostly just my YouTube channel.
All right. Well, thank you again for coming on, Dave. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, man. And do you have anything you want to say to the people before we head out? Anything you want to shout out? Like maybe is there any videos you would point people to that's kind of related to this? If they've watched for 2 hours, they're clearly into this stuff. So what would you point them to other than this?
I mean, if you want to see how I think that this deploys into a much stronger case for the resurrection than perhaps you would typically see, then I'd refer them to my 6-hour video on the resurrection of Jesus, where I show why all this gospel reliability stuff matters for making a case for the resurrection. So if they're really interested, want to get really nerdy, I'll probably refer them to that video.
Yeah, 6 hours on the resurrection. And what's interesting is they might say, how could you possibly defend the resurrection for 6 hours? But I mean, David here, he basically, as far as I can tell, you like engaged with every scholar on earth. It seemed like when they were like, this is why the resurrection didn't happen. And you like broke down their argument, explained why they were wrong. And I just thought it was so good. And I also loved your little section on why you prefer the maximal facts case versus the minimal facts case. Like all that stuff was really good too. And I totally agree, by the way. I think the maximal facts case is just significantly stronger than the minimal facts case. But I will ask you this, I guess, just one little question on that. I hear some people say, well, the benefit of the minimal facts case is that it's kind of like an elevator pitch, like I could say it in 60 seconds. Why do you think that that's like that there's any merit to that? Or do you think that you can give the maximal facts case faster? Or because there was an interesting video. I don't know if you're actually, I think you are familiar. In Philosopher's Garb, James Agnew.
He doesn't like me very much, but yeah, I know him.
Oh, okay. Well, he made a video a while back responding to, I want to say it was Than from Inspiring Philosophy, where Than was debating Alex O'Connor on that Jubilee channel where it was like surrounded, and basically James Agnew's critique was like, you can use the minimal facts case as like a starting point where it's like, here's these facts, you got to explain these, and then we can go from there. Because he basically said Than wanted to give this like, the gospels are reliable. And then he said, well, all Alex O'Connor is going to do is take that and say, all right, well, I'm just going to throw my objections at the gospels. And, oh, if you answer that one, here's another one. And if you answer that one, here's another one. And that's pretty much how the conversation went. And so I wonder what you think of that critique. Like, do you think there's any merit to the idea that, you can get the minimal facts on the table and then start from there? Or do you think that you should just start with the maximal facts in a conversation and go from there?
Yeah, I mean, the first point, the fundamental point is it's better to have an argument that actually works than an argument that is, quick and pithy and easy to put into an elevator pitch. So that's the first point, right? Like, is we don't want to be sacrificing the quality of our arguments just because it sounds pithier and quicker. The other point is I think that the sort of maximal data approach has had a lot of bad PR on some of these points. Some of that might be due, and I love her to death, but I think Lydia McGrew has a certain way of approaching things, and I love it. I love that she's feisty, and I love how thorough she is. But the fact of the matter is that doesn't resonate with everyone. And so I think that there's some work to be done in maybe giving like a PR makeover to maximal data. And, my friend Eric Manning from Testify, he's done some of that. I've come up with my own elevator pitch for the maximal data. I mean, it takes about 30 seconds. I don't know if you're familiar with the Clubhouse app, but like when I'm on there quite frequently, I'll get paired up with an atheist. And like, this is the way my elevator pitch goes for maximal data. I say, here's my case for the resurrection, right? We've got testimony saying that Jesus was resurrected in the 4 Gospels. I assume we all agree on that. I'm going to take it that this testimony comes from eyewitnesses. Given that it comes from eyewitnesses, you've got 3 options. It's true, it's deliberately false, or it's honestly mistaken. It's not plausible that it's deliberately false. It's not plausible that it's honestly mistaken. Therefore, it's true. If it's true, then the resurrection happened. That keeps it focused. There's 3 really easy points they can go after. You can challenge the eyewitness claim. You can challenge that they're lying. You can challenge that they're honestly mistaken in some way. Like, those are kind of the 3 vulnerable points. And I mean, I just try to keep them focused on that, right? Mm-hmm. Throwing out contradictions in the Gospels or gospel reliability. Not that you can't get into that, but like, I'm not setting it up that way.
Sure. Okay. Well, that's interesting. And I actually agree with you. I think that is a really strong way to do it. And one thing that I don't find helpful about a lot of these conversations from the skeptic side is that when you give a case for the resurrection, a lot of times they just say, oh, well, it's a miracle claim, and so therefore it just didn't happen, right? And so that I find so often that it even boils down to that. Like, a lot of times if you'll have the conversation and it's under the pretense of like, oh, well, I can't trust it because there's contradictions, or, oh, I can't trust it because, it wasn't written by eyewitnesses. And then when you get down to it, it's just David Hume. It's like, oh, well, you should have just started with that. Like, it's a miracle claim, therefore I can't believe it. So I wonder if that's been your experience. For me, when I talk to skeptics about the resurrection, it almost always goes back to Hume.
Yeah, even if it doesn't explicitly do so, there's usually like some sort of prejudice against miracles. And like, to an extent, I don't mind that, right? Like, I think in general, we should have a presumption against sort of the sorts of testimony that's out of the ordinary. But I don't think we want that presumption to be so strong that it could never be overcome, right? Mm-hmm. And so, I want to be careful about that with a skeptic, right? Mm-hmm. If they're just like giving me that there's some broad inductive presumption against a miracle, fine. But as long as the prior probability is not 0, you should agree with me it can be overcome by sufficient evidence. And I'm claiming we got it. So you're either going to have to argue that like the evidence is not sufficient to overcome the prior, or you're going to have to like start rejecting some of it, disputing some of the evidence that I'm presenting. And it's not going to help you just to say I put a low prior on miracles. If that's not what you're doing and you're using this as like some sort of, no, I'm just going to like use this to say miracles don't happen at all, they can never be rational, then like, sorry, you need to defend that, because there's no way to defend that. That is not going to like rule out believing in literally any rare event. If we're just going to be frequentists about probability and say like, I'm going to determine probability by reference to frequency, sorry, you can't believe in any rare events if that's your sort of approach to probability theory.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I think that like you said, I'm okay with it going to Hume, but it almost always ends up going to Hume, even if not explicitly, like you said. And I have one more question on the resurrection, just because I know you've defended it so extensively. I also like to, when I explain it to people, I like to put it within the biblical narrative as a whole. Like I was explaining it to a youth student the other day. It might have even been yesterday. Um, he kind of asked me like, why do you trust the Bible and all these things? And one of the pieces of data that I gave him was that the Bible seems to give this one coherent narrative that like points to resurrection and eternal life kind of being the end goal here. Because if we go back to Genesis, you've got the fall happening, and what happens? They're separated from the tree of life, right? And so now humans die, and there's all these issues. And then when Christ comes, what does he do? He promises eternal life, right? So he in Revelation, it gives access again to the tree of life. So there's like this coherent structure that this story is embedded in that makes sense. So it's like if we were to think about like if the Bible could possibly be true, like if Genesis was a real problem, what would the solution to that look like? And it seems to me like this resurrection hypothesis makes sense with that. And then on top of that, you put all the data that we have, where it's like the historical attestation, their willingness to, suffer and die for it, et cetera. I think kind of like embedding it in this narrative, at least it helps make sense for my youth students. I wonder if you think that discussing things like that is helpful, even if it doesn't logically follow, like the Bible is a coherent narrative, therefore the resurrection happened. I wonder if like you think it's helpful to kind of bring those points up.
Yeah, I think it can be. It depends to some extent on how it's being done. I very strongly don't want to give people the impression that a sort of robust Christian faith has to depend on sort of like the non-contradictoriness of the Bible, right? Because you spend so much time chasing down Bible contradictions. And I mean, I'm sure you did it at some point early on in your apologetics life. I know I did it, because that's the way it was like presented to me, is like one reason to believe the Bible is that like there's no contradictions. Well, then like what do I do with like these lists of thousands of contradictions, right? Atheist websites, like 100 Bible contradictions. Like I have to go down each one. Like, no, like I don't want people to get in that mindset, because I don't think it's a healthy place to be. I want them to be focused on the like robust historical evidence for the resurrection, Christianity, and like take an approach to, I can sort this other stuff out later. I'm not saying you shouldn't try to sort it out. I mean, there's still Bible contradictions I wrestle with to this day, I kind of believe that the Bible is inerrant, because I think that the resurrection of Christ gives me some reason to. But I don't believe it just because it's like so obviously manifestly inerrant. It's definitely coming from other things. Now, I'm not saying you are presenting it that way, right? Based on what you were saying, I wasn't getting that idea. I just want to be careful not to give people that impression. On the other hand, there's another way in which the stuff that you're bringing up is super relevant, because it's not just like somebody rose from the dead out of the blue. It's really important, I think, to emphasize the context of the resurrection of Jesus. They can do this in his immediate context, right? And this is typically what I do, right? Is he predicts that his resurrection is going to be sort of the divine vindication of his otherwise blasphemous claims. And so, it's a point that William Lane Craig likes to make, is that sort of the religio-historical context is what justifies you in inferring a miracle. So what I would see you as doing is giving like a lot more of that. It's not just the immediate context. It's that there was this prediction in the Old Testament, right? That a Messiah was coming. Jesus is presented as the fulfillment of that. Now, this gets tricky, if you're arguing with Jewish people, because they're going to, of course, want to argue Jesus doesn't actually fulfill messianic prophecies. I myself don't know how equipped I feel to debate that, so that's why I try to keep it focused on resurrection. But that's a long way of saying I don't think there's anything wrong with what you're doing. I just want to be very careful that I'm not giving people the impression that like you have to resolve every Bible contradiction.
Yeah. Definitely, I'm not doing that. I was doing more what you were just saying there, where I'm trying to add context to the resurrection itself, saying that it's embedded within a story, it's embedded within a context where it actually makes sense. And then when you have the historical data that we were talking about, where people are willing to suffer and die, claiming that it happened, and that our sources there are coming from eyewitnesses, it seems to me that it gives me at least more credence in the hypothesis. And there's a book that came out. It's called Resurrection, and it kind of I think it was like extraordinary evidence for an extraordinary claim or something like that. And yeah, that one. And he did bring in, like the predictions of the suffering servant and all that as context. And so that's kind of what got the book that got me thinking along these lines of like, okay, well, if there's like this theological context that it's embedded in, that does actually seem to give some reasons to favor the hypothesis as opposed to like, something else. Right. So, like Nehemiah saying like, they're going to look on me whom they've pierced. Right. It's like, so there seems to be some sort of like prediction that there's going to be Yahweh being pierced. Like, what does that look like? And you kind of go into all of it, and then you see what the claims of Jesus are. It all just seems like it's this robust, like coherent thing. And then on top of that, you have this historical case that you've built. It's like, now it's just, to me, ironclad. It's like you put all that together and it's just Christianity's true.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with that. Obviously, I've tried to dig in deep on what seems to me to be like the most critical element of it. But I have no problem with building on that, giving additional context, additional arguments. So I have no problem with a cumulative approach. I just I like to specialize deep on the biblical study stuff, and there's nothing wrong with going beyond that. Certainly.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, yeah, just wanted to pick your brain a little bit on the resurrection because, in my opinion, you're like one of the best defenders of it out there. So hopefully you guys got good stuff on the early dating of the Gospels, and now a little bit of a talk between two apologists on the resurrection. So you guys like and subscribe. David, thanks so much again for coming on. And for anybody that's watching and you enjoyed this, I'm going to link Dave's YouTube channel in the description below. It's called Faith Because of Reason. Go check it out. Go watch his videos. I highly recommend it. And do all the YouTube stuff, like, subscribe, comment, and we'll see you guys in the next one.